good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming on this blustery evening, but you couldn't have a better reason tonight. Try not to hit the mic. My name is Ana Lopico. I don't need to wear my glasses to remember that. I'm director of the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center here at NYU, a center dedicated to research and public scholarship on Spain, Latin America, the Hispanophone United States, and the world generally. Every year, the center welcomes 2 visiting distinguished chairs in Spanish or in Latin American cultures and civilization. When I began as director a year and a half ago, I asked the advisory board to turn the center's visiting chairs to a focus on journalism, reporting, and public intellectual practices. I couldn't have imagined a more illustrated thinker, a more experienced journalist, or a more acute cronista of the Latin American present than the man whom we are here to listen to tonight. This spring, therefore, we're immensely honored to welcome Jon Lee Anderson as the Andrés Bello Chair in Latin American Cultures and Civilization. As part of his residence, Jon Lee is teaching a course in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Culture. He will present, beginning tonight, 2 public lectures and will organize what is promising to be an extraordinary symposium on Latin America and political thought and the makers of political narrative later in this spring. Jon Lee Anderson began his career in the early 1980s, reporting on Central America's civil wars for syndicated columns for Jack Anderson, and later Time magazine. Before becoming a staff writer for The New Yorker, he wrote for The New York Times. His work has appeared in Harper's, El País, Internazionale, the Financial Times, The Guardian, you name it, and his name has been there. Here, The Nation, other periodicals and journals. As a New Yorker staff writer since 1998, he has covered numerous international conflicts, including those in Syria, Ukraine, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, Angola, Mali, Liberia, and the Central African Republic. I enumerate those to make clear that his experience in Latin America is very much a worldly perspective, and one that brings a deep historical and political rigor to his reporting. Jon Lee Anderson is also a celebrated biographer, essayist, and the author of books on contemporary conflict, military campaigns, and political power. He's particularly known, if you give me that, for this light tome that I hold in my hand, for this extraordinary biography of Che Guevara, but also for portraits of Latin American political leaders, including Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, and Augusto Pinochet. He's involved, and this is something that called our attention in the nomination process, he's involved and internationally recognized for teaching journalism and working to safeguard the rights of journalists, is on the board of the Colombia-based Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation for Journalism, and regularly teaches workshops for Latin American reporters. In Latin America, Anderson has reported on Brazil, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and just about every country in the hemisphere. When those of us picked up this book in 1997, those of us who are either Latin America, worked on Latin America, the narrative, the strength of the voice, the research in it, the rigor that it offered, transformed our sense of what a political biography of a figure like this can be, and of how Latin America can be understood. So I can't underestimate the importance of that biographical work, which has been shaped by his decades of experience as a reporter. While researching this book in Bolivia, some of you may know, many of you probably do, he discovered, or his research led to the discovering of the hidden location of Che's skeletal remains, which were then exhumed and returned to Cuba. I think it's an understatement to say that he transformed public and political understanding of Che and of the Cold War that framed Latin America for a half-century and continues to haunt it. Jon Lee Anderson has written several other books, quite a few, including Guerrillas, Journey in the Insurgent World, The Lion's Grave, Dispatches from Afghanistan, and The Fall of Baghdad. He's the co-author of Inside the League and War Zones, Voices from the World's Killing Grounds with his brother Scott Anderson. His present project is a biography of Fidel Castro. So, this fellow who you're about to hear embodies the seriousness of a catedrático and brings to the university an insight into Latin America rarely matched. As a journalist, writer, and defender of the profession, and as someone who's been writing about the culture, literature, and political history of Latin America for 30 years, he brings extraordinary experience and depth of knowledge to this Andrés Bello Chair. His capacity as an intellectual historian and political analyst is also impressive, and we're delighted that he brings that engagement to his teaching, his symposia, and his events. I won't go on, though I could. It's my pleasure to introduce the Andrés Bello Chair on Latin American Culture and Civilization, Jon Lee Anderson.
Thank you for that, Anna. It's very generous. Thank you all for coming. I was sort of torn by what I should speak about tonight, seeing as it's one of two public lectures I somehow got roped into giving, as well as a symposium. But but the title we came up with helps a lot, reporting on war and power in the Americas. I thought the best way to do this would be to kind of do a recuento, a recounting of what's been my career through that prism. And so I've jotted down a few notes. Bear with me while I go through them. Since the beginning of my career, I've been reporting essentially one basic story over and over in the Americas, and that is the imposition of American power in the region, often by military or covert means. In the 1980s, in the early 1980s, when Reagan was in office, the American hand that was often denied was everywhere, and that's where I cut my teeth as a young journalist. In Guatemala, the first place I really reported, the role was perhaps more concealed than elsewhere, but no less real for all of that. I went down in 1982, as Anna mentioned, one of my first jobs was as a kind of cub reporter for, at the time, very well-known syndicated columnist Jack Anderson, who had a daily column in the Washington Post and in 1,500 other newspapers in 70 countries. He was an important figure. And as one of his young underpaid staff members, the job we had was to come up with a scoop every day. I quickly fell into the kind of Latin American niche at the time I began to work with him, which was during the Malvinas, the Falklands War, and the very early days of Reagan, as Reagan unveiled a new strategy to unseat the Soviets in their, as he saw it, expansion in Latin America, and via covert means, America began to resume its former role as a preponderant power in the region after a few years of, you could say, of quiescence during the Carter years and following the Vietnam defeat. In the course of that trip to Guatemala, I interviewed the then dictator president, a guy called Efraín Ríos Montt, who was a born-again Christian, and overtly had only tangential ties to the United States. The United States, while it was heavily invested in El Salvador, had a more of a discrete role in Guatemala. The Israelis armed the Guatemalans, not the Americans. There was a lot of deniability as to the degree to which the administration was involved in the frankly abhorrent succession of military regimes that had taken power. Ríos Montt seemed to be a break in the routine. I went to see him to ask him, I was very young at the time, and to ask him, what was going on. And he informed me, amongst other things, that as I could see, there had been a marked human rights improvement. There were no more bodies on the streets, which is to say there were no more death squads dumping bodies openly on the streets of the capital and other places. And I asked for a safe conduct in order to travel into the countryside where it was being reported, it was rumored that major battles were taking place with the guerrillas. It was just before news of the great slaughter of the indigenous communities. It was as it was beginning. I was given this safe conduct pass and found myself journeying fairly blindly around a countryside that was it's like something out of a scene in Apocalypse Now, actually. Military men sandbagged in bivouacs in indigenous communities, their faces covered. Those communities obviously terrified at the passing of any car, the approach of any car. Very often they would disappear at the sight of there was nobody on the road. I remember walking through a series of hamlets, stopping the car and approaching a hamlet that looked deserted, and one hamlet after the other in a valley full of little communities, little agricultural settlements, and finding children's toys, bloodied women's clothing, no bodies that I could see, just this kind of ghostly silence. Then whenever there was someone still alive in these areas, they would have the Guatemalan flag. So I tried to find out what was going on. And eventually I learned that, of course, the army had gone through, was massacring the indigenous communities for their alleged support of the guerrillas. And that was what I was seeing. In the course of one of these trips I took outside of the capital, I came across a scene one day that I couldn't really compute, I couldn't make sense of, which was a large, hundreds and hundreds of indigenous people being herded in a forest, a pine forest between hills, into plastic shelters. They were all being herded by the Guatemalan military. And I spent part of a day in and amongst them, again with this safe conduct pass that allowed me to get past patrols, but in an atmosphere of almost complete silence. Nobody spoke. And on this day, in this little place called San Martín Jilotepeque, I remember it very well, nobody spoke. Nobody spoke to me. I mean, I was very aware why, because within earshot, every time I did try to speak to somebody, there was a military commissar, there was someone there. And they also, as I recall it, tried to get rid of me pretty quickly. I remember one unsettling scene from that same day, which was coming into the plaza of one of the small villages and seeing 4 or 5 soldiers leading, I think it was 3 men, they'd obviously captured them, through the plaza. And they had nooses around their necks. They were leading them by what looked like hangman's nooses. And these men looked at me as they passed. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was looking at people that were going to be killed. And to be sure about that, I followed this little scene. I followed this group to a farmhouse that the military had taken over. And as I approached, one of the soldiers, an officer, stopped me and said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I want to find out what's happening with those men." And he just drew his hand across his throat and told me to leave. And there was always this intimidation in Guatemala. There was always this sense of the kind of swirling, prevailing terror of the regime. The reason for this anecdote, and the reason I began in Guatemala happened so long ago, at the very beginning of my career, is because there was a kind of a cautionary coda to this that emerged. I returned to Guatemala City after a few days, and I got a call unusually, from the PAO of the American Embassy. PAO is the Public Affairs Officer. I still remember his name, Marty Ronan. And I guess I had gone to see him for something at the beginning of my time there. You know, if you work for anybody, any American journal, you're always pushed to go see the people at the American Embassy. I'd probably been shown to him. At any rate, he called me at the hotel I was staying in. He said, "John, I hear you were in San Martin, Hilotepec. Will you come into the embassy? I've got to talk to you." I guess that was it. So I was intrigued, never having been summoned like that before. And I went in, and he said, "We hear you were in San Martin, Hilotepec. What did you see? What's going on?" I told him what I'd seen, which wasn't much, just this kind of surreal scene of indigenous people being herded, under the custody of military men. He said, "Did you see anything like a massacre?" I said, "No, I didn't see anything like that." He said, "Oh, okay, great. Well, we'll see you in the next few days, whatever." I went back to my hotel. I think it was the next day, I got a call from a friend, another young reporter who worked for Jack in Washington. He said, "Jon Lee, what did you do?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You were quoted yesterday by the administration as a source to deny the rumors or reports of a massacre in San Martin Hilotepec at a human rights subcommittee being presided over by Senator Edward Kennedy on the Hill." And I was, of course, completely shocked by this and outraged and all the rest of it. But it was too late. The damage had been done. A few things like this happened to me early on in my career, and helped, I think, probably forge my character as someone who is generally distrustful of the status quo, of the establishment of power, and more or less convinced that, given the right opportunity, those in power will use you for their own narratives. By this time, El Salvador had already happened. The conflict in El Salvador had already begun. I soon moved there and began to live there and was reporting there. And I was reporting there for Time magazine. At the time, the US government was making a strong effort to buttress the idea of a democratic change, a change of government. Military regime was gone. There was now elections. The idea that the worst was in the past was the ethos of the time. The great atrocities that had occurred, the Mozote massacre of over 800 people, the killing of Archbishop Romero, the rape and murder of the American nuns, these had all just happened. They were in the backdrop. These were essentially uninvestigated and ignored incidents. They were paid lip service to, but as a young reporter working at the time I was reporting for Time magazine, I quickly learned that these were just somehow like suits you don't wear hanging in the closet. You don't really go there. They're inconvenient. You might get out of a political attaché or someone out of Washington a kind of implicit recognition that there was something bad had happened. But actually, for a fair amount of time, especially with events like Mozote, there was even a denial that they had occurred at all. It was pretty obvious that these events had in fact occurred with US acquiescence and been brushed aside, as lamentable excesses on the road to a noble objective, which was again the triumph of democracy over communism. The prevailing narrative in Washington and most American newsrooms at the time was that there was no greater evil than communism. I was increasingly troubled by this kind of cognitive dissonance I found between what was my supposed job in covering the reality and relaying it, and what I saw on the ground. And I increasingly tried to seek out either alternative narratives that were usually on the other side of the war, or testimony from the perpetrators themselves of these horrible events. On a trip I made with the Nicaraguan Contras in 1983, it was just before, it was very early days, it was before everyone knew that they were in fact financed and armed, created a creation of the CIA. I went with them for a week with a friend who was a photographer, and we spent a week with this small group, a platoon, about 20 as I recall, made up of former National Guardsmen and peasants, and we hiked at night and hid by day, and would sort of take catnap in thickets, and then every few days they would have an emissary from a village that we camped near come, and they would exchange information. There was this kind of sense that it was an intelligence gathering mission, and over time I realized that in my encounters with these, in my conversations with the Contras, I realized that what they were doing was gathering an assassination list of people that they would need to kill were they to take over and prevail in these areas. It wasn't long after that some of you might remember there was in fact the scandal of the so-called CIA assassination manual, which appeared in the press. And again, I was working for Time magazine at the time. Time magazine used to work in the following way: if it had an issue-related story like that one, okay, we're going to do 2 pages on the assassination manual. We want to put this thing to bed. Let's talk to all of the people in the various bureaus who might have anything to do with it. I was a lowly stringer and therefore kind of last on the list. But in fact, I was probably the person who knew the most about it. By the time it got to me, the narrative that was being constructed in Washington and also in Time was that it really hadn't been implemented. This was a really bad decision by some idiot at CIA who had copied, as I recall, a Viet Cong journal and somehow translated it into Spanish and handed it out to Contras as a way to teach them guerrilla strategy. And there was a section on what you do with spies and squealers, and you kill them. And it was being put to bed fairly quickly in Washington as something that hadn't really gotten out of hand. So I was asked about this. And of course, I had had that experience with the Contras and a couple of others, including one where a Contra commander had told me that he told me how and why they killed their prisoners. And in the case of this one commander in this region, he told me that they used the youngest fighters to kill the prisoners. And the reason for that was because they hadn't learned a conscience yet. They made them dig their own graves, and then they beat them to death or stabbed them to death. And that was the modus operandi. When in shock and horror, I asked this commander, I remember him very well, Samba, why he did that. And he said, why they used the youngest. And he said, well, no tienen conciencia todavía, es más fácil para ellos. They haven't learned a conscience yet, it's easier for them. So I did tell, and again, I had been with him within sight of a village where he had said there's a teacher there, her husband, there's a health worker. These are all people that have to be eliminated. This was straight out of the manual, and I reported it. It was tidied up and saw some attenuated version in the final published account, but it didn't help me particularly in Washington, or with Time for that matter either. as it turned out. Again and again, I came across realities that were submerged, that were difficult to live with. And since I was a journalist supposedly reporting what I was seeing, it caused me no small crisis of conscience. I remember the most clearly, which was on another trip with the overall leader of the Contras to a very muddy corner of central Nicaragua via helicopter. I spent 3 days with one of his commanders there, a little guy called Tigrillo, a little tiger, or ocelot. And it was muddy, it was miserable. Even the mules fell down, they couldn't stand up. This guy, Enrique Bermudez, at one point, looking out over his men in his mud wash of a jungle camp, he stuck to me quite a bit. At one point he just turned to me and he said, I feel a lot more at home in Bethesda than I do here, he said. And he, no kidding, he actually said that. But he was supposedly the leader of a war that was battling the regime at the time, causing thousands of deaths in order to assume power. Anyway, for a few days we were with this guy, Tigrillo, and I noticed he always had this rather pretty woman with him, about 30. As she would follow him on foot, he would ride. I think he rode a horse, we had mules. And she would follow him by foot, and whenever there was a stream we'd come to, she would stoop and wash his socks. And it was clear that she was somehow his lover, mistress, whatever. I think at the second day, Tigrillo was out of camp, so was Enrique Bermudez, and I was left alone with Merida, that was her name, and a few of the guys at the cook fire. They dealt with la cantina, they cooked the food. And we sat around, I think they made me a coffee, and then suddenly Merida blurted out her story, in which she begged me for help. She was a hostage. She had been made Tigrillo's slave after being abducted from her home, taken from her husband, her 2 children, along with 3 other people from her village. After a stop in the forced march into the mountains following her abduction, they had stabbed to death the other teachers and health workers with her, and then told her that they would spare her life if she joined them. And of course, she immediately became Tigrillo's woman. It had been about 1.5 years earlier. And she broke down and cried and said that, she was terrified that she could never return to her family. Her husband wouldn't accept her back. What could she do? I could see from all of the eyes of the men around her that she was telling the truth. They were sympathetic. They were telling me this, seizing a moment in this otherwise supposedly uniform army in which the leaders went around. Anyway, I could do nothing for her other than give her a slip of paper with my telephone number in Honduras, where I was staying at the time, and told her if she could ever get to the border to call me and I would help her. I never heard from her. But I also found that such stories I had no outlet for. And so I remember distinctly that story, and the reason I tell it is kind of to revive her life a little bit. And I had to write her story, so I remember I wrote it for the San Diego Union, because I didn't really have anywhere else to write it at the time. How many people saw that story? Who knows? 300? 1,350? I have no idea. But increasingly, I found that, this issue of needing to tell, needing to unburden myself and to share what I had learned, which in some cases could help shape public opinion about these conflicts. And there was, I could go on. I spent time with perpetrators too. Again, in an effort, in an environment in which ultimate power, it was clear you could always trace whatever was happening somehow back to either a directive or an abdication of moral authority or a policy orientation that came out of Washington. There was no question that in each of these, for me, very disquieting, very troubling episodes, the hand of my country was somehow there. It was prevalent. Mosote had been carried out by the first US trained counterinsurgency battalion, the Atlacat battalion. The Contras were financed out of Washington. And perhaps what was a kind of culminating moment for me in all of this, in El Salvador, I managed to find time to spend part of a week with a man called Coronel Domingo Monterrosa, Colonel Domingo Monterrosa. He was the head of the Atlacat battalion. He had been the commander at the time of the Mosote massacre. He had never spoken about it, nor had anyone ever demanded that he speak about it. This was now 4 years later, I guess, October 1985. I had never been asked by Time, or anyone else for that matter, to talk to him about it. It was only a personal issue I had, because he was the darling of the press. When I arrived in El Salvador to live there and to work for Time in 1984, he was the guy you went to, had drinks with, hung out with, was friendly to the press. He even had a lover amongst the press corps. As far as I knew, nobody had ever talked to him about Mosote. Anyway, long story short, Time magazine asked me if I would, what they were interested in was these new counterinsurgency operations, which showed that, in fact, the democratic government, the effort was working, and Domingo Monterrosa was in charge of a major counterinsurgency sweep, which I, as a member of the press, along with a good friend of mine, photographer, Bob Nicholsberg, were invited to go along with. So for several days, we traveled with him in these helicopters, coming in and out of villages where the guerrillas had just run off, and so forth. On the next day of this sweep, we arrived in a little hamlet called Huateca, I think it was. And I saw Monterrosa go off. He disappeared with some of his men into what was the town cemetery. And when he came back, he emerged. I was right there at the entrance to the cemetery, sitting on the stoop of a bombed out house. And he was really happy, and he walked straight over to me. And he said confidingly, exclaiming, really, really excited, he said, I found it. I said, what have you found? He said, Radio Venceremos. I found it. I found the transmitter. Everyone knew that his bête noire was Radio Venceremos, the rebel radio, which lambasted him and challenged him every day from its clandestine places throughout the mountains. And there he believed he found it. He said, I found it. He sat down next to me and he was really excited. I said, this is my moment. To myself, I said, this is my moment to ask him about Mosote. So taking advantage of his elation, sitting next to him, I said to him, Coronel, I have to ask you a question. Por favor. He said, whatever, what is it? And I said, tell me the truth tell me about Mosote. What happened there? And his face closed down. He looked away from me. He changed. He looked down for a long time. And he looked at me glancingly, but he didn't really meet my eyes, and he said, I can't talk about that now. The only thing I can tell you is that it's not like they say. And that was it. It was a confirmation to me, not only that it had taken place, but the man who was in charge of it knew it, and he just couldn't deal with it. It was a confirmation. The coda to that story is that my friend Bob the photographer, convinced me that we had to leave that same evening for San Salvador, because in those days there was no internet or anything. We had to send by telex. It was filing day or something. We had to file, and then, so we arranged to go to San Salvador and then fly back the next day. In the course of the time that we flew to San Salvador and came back, Colonel Monterrosa got the rebel radio transmitter, put it on his helicopter. Several other commanders that had heard of this amazing feat arrived and got on board the helicopter with him, began to go up into the sky, and when they got to 1,400 feet, the guerrillas who were hiding in the outskirts of Huateca hit the plunger on the explosive hidden in the rebel radio transmitter, sending Colonel Domingo Monterrosa and his friends to Kingdom Come. It was one of the greatest coups by the guerrillas in that war that lasted 12 years. But of course, Domingo Monterrosa took his secrets to his grave. But just before that, I would like to say that I think he admitted it to me, but he couldn't bring himself to fully confess. I've got a lot of very kind of macabre stories. I'm not sure I should tell them all. You all just end up completely depressed. ¿Cómo estamos de tiempo? Todavía. Relativo. Okay, I mean, just to sum up. I'll sum up with one last depressing anecdote, and then I found a way out of it. A couple of years later, I finally managed to sit down with one of the infamous, I should say, miembros del Escuadrón de la Muerte de El Salvador, the secret anti-communist army, the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez Brigade, the various names they gave themselves. In effect, they were the people of the state. They were the paramilitaries of the state, created by the military establishment, the police establishment, the intelligence establishment, and not without some knowledge and complicity by our intelligence in their early days as well. The most visible face of the death squads was Colonel Roberto Dalbison, who sadly died of tongue cancer just a few years later. But nonetheless, I managed to finally sit down with one of these guys. They were very difficult to get to. And he agreed to meet me in the worst part of San Salvador. It's where the guaraperos are, like the prostitutes that are alcoholic, and the places where people drink guaro, rotgut booze at any hour of the day for not much money. A really squalid place. And there was a room above this market where I met him one day at about 2 o'clock. And I got in there, and it was just a room, a bare room with a desk. There was this man in his 40s, burly man in his 40s, sitting at this desk. There was a telephone on the desk. There was a revolver on the desk underneath a newspaper. I think it was the Diario de Hoy, which was also the trumpet chronicle of the death squads. They always had the news first. And we sat down and began to talk. And he told me how it worked. His name was, I called him El Gato, I forget his original name. And he and his best friend, Cara de Puta, horse face, were buddies in this killing team. They told me how they did it, how the whole modus operandi, how there was a place in the police station where they would go and they would wear wigs or disguises. They would decide how they would dress up that night. Sometimes they'd go out as women, sometimes they'd go out as whatever. And they would go out and they would grab the people on their list. And they would comfort the people on their list. They would tell them everything was going to be all right. They just needed to go and talk with them. They would collect 10, 12, 15 people, and they would take them to one of the various places that they killed them. You know, one was a place called La Boca del Diablo It's now a scenic spot on the outskirts of a volcano just outside of the Salvadoran capital. Sometimes it was at Playón, a kind of volcanic scree, also near the capital. Other places. And until the last minute, he said everybody believed that they were going to live. And he kept referring to them as los clientes, the clients. And finally, they would kill them. And they had a guy that they took along with them who was an orphan, who had grown up. He was a mascot of the police station. And he would usually beg them to have sex with the prettiest corpse. And he would, it gets worse. I'll spare you some of the details. In the end, there's just one surreal moment in this whole thing. The phone suddenly rang in this room. You can imagine how chilling it was to sit with this guy. The phone rings and he gets the phone and he becomes irate and has this raging conversation. And he gets furious and hangs up the phone up eventually. And then he tells me that his daughter of 12, who died a couple of years before, his only child, had been, he'd paid for her to be in a niche, in a mausoleum. But he hadn't kept up the payment, so they were tossing her out into the beggar's pit. And that was what he was mad about. I just thought it was so appropriate somehow. It's a bit of a non sequitur, but I thought you couldn't have come up with something better than that, really. Anyway, the long and the short of it, and the point brings back to this, the point of this story, is that he said that his best friend, Cara de Puta, with whom he'd done all the killing, had been gunned down just a few months earlier. That was why he carried his piece, and he was anxious, he was worried, because what was happening was that Washington had changed its policy because they had now required human rights certification of the new government. And of course, the military, the very same military that had been doing all of this before, the men who were the trigger men, and he told me there was about 240 in all, it was a very specific figure, were running scared. And some of them were turning state's evidence to protect themselves. The FBI was now involved. They needed to come up with some culprits for a few cases. And so they had begun to kill one another. And I was interviewing him right in the middle of this killing spree that had begun, I think, the year before or some months before. And Cara de Puta had gone the way of the dodo because of that. And he was worried that he'd be next. So, once again, there I was confronted with the most abhorrent of situations, and it had a direct relationship to my country and its policymakers with all of their high-minded speeches and notions back in Washington. So what does all this mean and how did it play out? And again, the title of this we chose was War and Power in the Americas, so thus this story. By and large, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formal end of the Cold War, everyone sued for peace, with the exception of Colombia. All the other conflicts wound to a close. Military regimes were, by and large, replaced by laissez-faire democracies, many of which proved to be corrupt. And then, even as America congratulated itself on the triumph over communism, Hugo Chavez emerged from the shadows in Venezuela. Chavez, like Fidel before him, was anxious about the US and what it might do to thwart his dreams of a Bolivarian revolution. He told me in 2001 that he was determined not to, quote, end up like Noriega. And when I said, what do you mean, end up like Noriega? And he said, humiliated, wearing a jumpsuit. Do all of you remember that photo? Mm-hmm. Chavez ended up as he did, of course. He died of cancer, 3 years ago. And we see Venezuela today, once again, as a kind of proving ground between those who see themselves as rebels of the empire and those who have always seen themselves as somehow part of the American-led compact or firmament of nations, Patria Libre, Miami, some might say. We'll see how it ends. But beyond Venezuela, something else is happening. Something that is entirely new in my decades of reporting war and power in the Americas. and that is the restoration of relations by the US with Cuba, which has also come with an American admission of failure. This represents a sea change in the US approach to its neighbors in the region. With it too comes US support for the Colombian peace deal with the FARC guerrillas, the last such conflict in the Americas, set in motion so long ago, in part because of US policies. This is new, this is big, and may mean, finally, an end to complicity with criminals as an adjunct of US foreign policy in the region. I'm being naive here, just for a moment. And a new template on which to build relationships in the future. At the very least, perhaps the wars of the future will not be seen as US wars. Then again, as a Cuban friend wrote me this week, I translated this a little clumsily from the Spanish, at the very last minute, bear with me here. Things are great now, this is speaking this week in an email. Hablando de, tú sabes, del acercamiento norteamericano en Cuba. But what happens when Obama leaves office? And what happens if Trum Trum comes in? She calls him Trum Trum. She said, I know the answers, and remember what Che always said. And I know the answers, full stop. And I remember what Che always said. With the imperialists, not even an inch. Ni tanto así. O sea, doubt, skepticism, caution. So we'll see how it plays out. But so on that note, which is slightly upbeat, less macabre than all of the stories I dragged you through, I shall end con el imperio ni tanto así.
I always wonder how people like you, like outsiders in these dangerous situations, can survive. What's the strategy to survive? How don't get killed?
Well, some people know how to talk about baseball or sports or play cards. I've never been good at those. A few years ago, basically it's make friends with the people who might otherwise want to kill you. A few years ago, I found myself with a bunch of mercenaries, and I realized that the one thing that I could talk about with them was hunting. They all like to hunt. When they weren't killing people, they like to kill animals. I'm not a hunter, but I know that world, and I can talk about it. I couldn't talk about football or baseball or ice hockey or play poker, but I could talk about hunting, and that put them at their ease. Basically, it's finding something, putting people at their ease, finding something. I don't know, I try not to be judgmental in the moment. I try to, maybe they sense that, and so they talk. But I want to hear their story. And then luck, lots of luck. Luck is key. Some people are unlucky.
How many friends of yours got killed?
Lots.
What's out?
In my life?
No, in these situations, in Latin America.
Well, more in Syria and Libya in the last 4 years than in my entire life. But altogether, yeah. I lost a few friends. And I came close to getting killed too. It wasn't without mishap. I had one interview with a Salvadoran colonel. I'm pretty sure he was one of the guys blown up with Monterrosa. But anyway, I went to see him in his garrison. And we had an interview. And then I left the interview and I traveled to the river north of his garrison and I began to cross the river in my car. It actually was a bad decision because the river was up and the car got flooded. And I was with two friends who were photographers. The point about this was on the other side of the river was guerrilla territory. Anyway, that army commander sent out a patrol to eliminate us when we were in the river, claiming that he thought it was terrorists, international terrorists there, knowing full well that it was me who had just left his office. Anyway, we survived, and he was promoted. He was promoted. We even managed to get the State Department to protest that one, and he wasn't reprimanded. He was promoted, I think, from lieutenant colonel to full colonel within a week or two. So that was the message to the press corps, and that was the new Democratic Army too. Anybody else? Hi, and then.
I wanted to ask you, after all the writing that you've done, after all the reporting that you've done, many other people have done, and human rights defenders have done in Latin America, why you think the discourse about Latin America, the level of discourse about Latin America is so low in the United States. And basic things like the Soul genocide in the Americas in the 20th century happened in Guatemala, or that the Soul trial for genocide against indigenous people against Efraín Ríos Montt happened. Like, it's not in the general discourse.
Sorry, the Soul genocide? Oh, the Soul, sorry. Yeah.
The Soul.
Yeah, I was thinking Soul.
S-O-L-E.
Yeah.
Only.
Yeah. Because with the exception of that very brief period when Ronald Reagan declared El Salvador, like he also once did Chad, by the way, briefly, it lasted about 3 weeks, a national security priority of the United States in the national interest. It was a little more sustained in Central America, as we remember. It went on from, basically 82 to what, the 80s. It was a 3 or 4 year period in which, and interestingly, in lockstep pretty much with those kinds of sermons out of the White House, or those policy initiatives, the press generally follows suit. I remember for the election in El Salvador in 1984, 700 journalists arrived. I mean, when Benghazi fell to the revolt in 2011, there wasn't anything like that there. There was maybe 40 journalists. When Osama bin Laden, when the Soviets had pulled out of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen that we had armed along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia decided that they would besiege the city of Jalalabad as a final effort to take Kabul in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and Osama bin Laden's people were beginning to arrive, the Arab Jihadi first volunteers. I was one of 8, maybe 9 Western journalists covering that event. If it's not declared to be a policy priority in the national interest, nobody ignores it. When was the last time? It's only since we bombed Libya the other day that how difficult is it to get Libya on the front pages? It's not so easy. Not only do we have a kind of monothematic culture, but we move on. We move on. We won, so we moved on. It reverted to being Central America. Dunkin' Donuts, that's what it is today. Dunkin' Donuts and gangs. He said cynically, but it is. That's what it is. And some places are safe for tourism again. So, we won, they lost, and that's the end of it. And so you lurch on to the next crisis. I mean, I think Central America wasn't helped. It's never acquired a legacy in the American consciousness for another reason, which is timing. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening up of the East to American perceptions and all of that meant, the emergence of 15 countries out of one, the then the first Gulf War meant that Central America was quickly forgotten in the big geostrategic game and never been revisited. You know when it will be revisited? When it starts to haunt us again. We, all of us, not just Americans, not just Washington, should be a bit worried by what's happened, that there is a legacy, and the legacy has come in the form of a criminalized culture. Countries without rule of law, where the wars were ended with pacts of impunity for all. And very few people who committed those sorts of crimes are in jail for them. There's serial killers walking around today freely in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, growing old without ever having been punished for a thing they did. That's why.
So I was, thank you for sharing the early part of your career, which I wasn't acquainted with. So, you made clear that what you were able to witness back then, this kind of little known kind of US hand in many of these, the civil wars in Central America then. And I was wondering if you could also talk about what is kind of driving your reporting on Latin America in the present. And of course, I'm most acquainted with your work in the New Yorker, but I'm like, oh, the Marzali profile recently, or you talked about the fixer in Cuba, you talked about the canal in Nicaragua. So it's kind of, I'm wondering, they're kind of more disparate subjects, and I'm wondering what you see as, what is the purpose of your reporting on Latin America today in this present moment?
Well, Latin America's, although I've gone away for periods of time, and in an effort to understand the rest of the world, Latin America's always been a kind of first true love, in a way. I've always held it close. I've always wanted to be back there. I've always wanted and found different ways to do that, which include, when I was very much reporting in the Middle East and also Africa more, I came back, once, sometimes twice a year in my guise as a teacher for the Garcia Marquez Foundation. It was a way for me to kind of stay in touch, plug back in with a region I love and feel part of, And so, to that extent, there's plenty of stories I haven't covered that I would have liked to over the years, mostly for editorial reasons, sometimes because I was in another place. But I've tried also to accompany processes that seem to flow out of the realities that I began reporting so long ago, which include Chavez and Venezuela, Cuba, which for me was, the kind of the mothership to all of the revolutionary struggles, which I began reporting the hot flashes of, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in these places. In the 80s, I cut my teeth reporting on the guerrilla struggles and counterinsurgency battles that, had their origin to a larger, lesser degree with the Cuban Revolution. So I was always fascinated by Cuba. It led me there. I developed a strong interest initially in power, but also in the nature of political violence, in political violence itself, and in insurgent struggle, the psyche of the culture of insurgency. And that's what led me initially to leave Latin America and to go on around the world and to live with and report on guerrillas in different parts of the world. That in turn led me to Che as the personification of that kind of individual, and led me to Cuba, and then back to Latin America. So I feel I understand the logic of political violence, what makes it tick, what brings it about. I guess as a student of political violence, but also as someone who loves Latin America and feels comfortable in it, who has lived in it, off and on throughout my life. So I go to a lot of places and have meetings that I don't necessarily write about either. In the last year, I've also been in Bolivia and Panama and Argentina and Chile and Peru and Colombia and El Salvador and Mexico, none of which have appeared necessarily in the New Yorker. It's part of an ongoing inquiry I have into how things are shaping up and the nature of nature of things. One of the things I'm troubled with, or troubled by, I should say, is this replacement of the age of insurgency with endemic, how would we call it? If you could say that the underclass of today no longer goes up to the mountains to fight for a new man, you know. It wears gold chains and stays in the slums, in the barrio. You've got a criminalized underclass that's extensive, transformative, and an increasing part of the social reality in a lot of Latin American countries, not divorced, not disconnected from our own society, but it's not perceived as connected. And the reporting, that troubles me, and I feel that that's a narrative we have yet to kind of hoist on board and get in, and find a way to address in our perceptions. I'm fascinated right now by the note I ended on, by the nature of the change between the U.S. and the region through this peace deal, this restoration of relations with Cuba. I think it's major, it's transcendental. And if handled correctly, I mean, there's plenty of naysayers and skeptics on both sides and throughout the region, but I prefer to be a bit of an optimist at the moment, because this is at least better than what was there before. And as an American, I've always felt that it was necessary for us to assume more responsibility for our actions, knowing full well how the legacy of those actions in so many countries around the world. To our discredit and to our disadvantage, we have ignored the legacy of what we've done. It doesn't mean we have to go around beating ourselves with a stick and as kind of, you know, adamantena, you know, but we need to address it full on, like Obama did when he admitted that the embargo was failed. Everybody knew it, had known it for years. By doing so, he reasserted honesty and a certain amount of moral conviction into American foreign policy. You know, and I think that was important. So I'm kind of thrilled by at this juncture, and I want to accompany it as much as possible going forward. Certain places still worry me a lot. Like I say, the kind of narco culture that's destroying swatches of Latin America, particularly Mexico and Central America, but also parts of cultures elsewhere. The high incidence of violence in quite a few Latin countries is really worrying, and it all comes down to lack of rule of law. We've invested heavily in making countries safe for American investment and getting a kind of rotating chair kind of style of democracy going without ever really helping invest in rule of law, in creating the kind of institutions and helping foster institutions that will allow countries to develop a civic culture, rein in their corrupt police and judges, and have societies where people don't have to worry about their kids. You know, it's something that we've been very robust when we've been bully boys and done very little when it comes to investing in a kind of good neighborliness with the people we have closest to us and with whom we coexist in this country as well. So, I mean, again, sadly, until we have a president that takes on board the extent to which that's a real problem, we're not going to see major change, because there will always be the emergency policies that react to the larger events of the day. And Latin America will, typically, will be left there to fester and slumber away. Anyway, but, sir, yeah.
I have a question back here.
Oh, right.
Just following on what you said about Cuba and how Cuba is very different from the rest of the Latin American countries for historical reasons. what do you envision going forward when there's sort of such an American explosive involvement in Cuba, if that is in fact what happens? Will it be Dunkin' Donuts and 7-Eleven, or is Cuba kind of protected from what we've seen happen in other parts of Latin America?
The short answer is I don't know. As we all know, people tend to like what they haven't had, and that's true in Cuba as it is everywhere else. So that mitigates against a kind of cultural wall of imperviousness that will somehow, seal and protect Cuban heritage from destruction. But I think we're going to see a piecemeal scenario evolve. I mean, first of all, you have to remember that most of what's happening is happening legally and rhetorically. That is to say, you have these, you have more Americans going to Havana. They haven't brought any change that's visible yet, other than their presence. There are any number of CEOs and corporations that have gone down there and done the dance of the 7 veils for the Cubans. For the moment, the Cubans have allowed them to show their wares and go home again. And they're sitting there thinking, who's the prettiest suitor at the ball? And they're in a kind of, they're in the driver's seat at the moment. They can pick and choose who they do business with. My hunch, knowing the Cubans and the way they've dealt with the outside world since the first opening, remember, after the Soviet collapse, the Periodo Especial, they began to allow tourism, they began to have some joint ventures. What is to apportion it to as many people as they can in addition to the Americans. So that the Americans are never in a position to have a preponderant role, ownership role in the various parts of the Cuban economy as they did before. I mean, on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, the Americans pretty much owned the place. Everything from the electricity to most of the arable land, the ferries, the airlines, the television stations, on and on and on and on, was American owned. I'm not sure what the situation is in various Central American countries or today. And having said what I just said, with the kind of free trade agreements we've signed and the incredible power of the global dollar, there's going to be some of that in Cuba. But there's also a lot of Cubans who cherish and respect their heritage, who have been traveling for the past 20 years and have seen the outside world and see its excesses and the ways in which Havana and other cities and the countryside in Cuba needs to be protected from the kind of development, sprawl, the strip mall culture that has become, maybe the showpiece of the American dream. One would hope. But I fear there is going to be some. There is going to be some, and but no guarantees, which makes the whole process so fascinating, because all of these decisions and all of these issues are being debated and worried over right now from various points of view. So it's unique, it's unusual. All of us were, I think, taken by surprise, and whatever happened in countries like Russia or Kazakhstan or Ukraine when it happened. It was so big and full and so precipitous that I don't think anybody was saying, oh no, is McDonald's going to open up in the Maidan? Which it did, by the way. And of course it did. It had already done so in Moscow. But will it happen in Havana? I don't know. The Cubans have also had 25 years to see what happens when you allow the Trojan horse through the gates of the city. Which is, by the way, what a lot of people of a certain age in Cuba regard this as el caballo de Troya de los Yankees del Imperio, Like my friend who wrote in the email about los imperialistas ni un tantito así. Don't give them an inch.
Actually, my point, First of all, thank you very much for sharing with us your recuento. My question prior to the lady back there was regarding Cuba as well. 2 days ago, I had an opportunity to listen to Giovanni Sanchez. And just like your friend, I like to contrast her assertions and her concerns with the way that your friend brought to you. For her is what will happen once Obama leaves Havana. The Pope was here, and things have not changed. And we are highly concerned about, civil society. We are highly concerned about what happens in, Centro Havana. We're concerned about what happens in the interior parts of Cuba that we don't see changes happening. Her main concern was that they saw a lot of changes coming out of Washington, but very few changes getting out of Cuba, not towards the relationship with the Americans, but actually with the rest of the Cubans. And their concern is their country. For them, the imperialist is the ruling elite that has prevailed in Cuba for a long time, 57 years and counting. So my question is, and probably is more about you sharing with us your views about changes from within, not changes from without. How do you see the transformation of Cuban society, the transformation of the government in Cuba in the next few years? As you know, yesterday Ramon Castro passed away. It's only biological. And then who is going to replace that ruling elite on the long-term basis?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, these are all valid questions, and they're also being asked, like by people like Giovanni and others, and it's part of the exchange taking place now between the Americans and the Cubans, most of which isn't being shared for reasons of political sensitivity and so on. But I know some of the people involved in these talks, and I know that it's more than lip service. Now, the changes of that type, let me back up. It's Ioanni's job to point her finger in the boil, and to demand immediate change and quick change for what she sees as immoral, unlawful, or overdue. But those sorts of changes will take place, is my understanding, it's my sense, in their good time. For the moment, what you have from the Cubans is a decision to open to an indeterminate degree economically, but it's transcendental and transformational. For the first time in years, Cubans are becoming the arbiters of their own economic lives, independent of the revolution, independent of the state. That is having an effect, psychological effect, and a real social effect. The revolution, the custodians of the revolution, the gerontocracy of the Castro brothers and so on, is aware of that, and they have a plan for the succession to follow Raúl with his vice president, a party bureaucrat named Díaz-Canel, who not much is known about, but I guess we'll know a lot more about him when he takes office, just as we have in so many other countries where a kind of loyal party, younger apparatchik from a new generation has taken power. I would just say this: I don't know his truth any more than anybody else does. If you ask in Cuba, you'll hear he's austere, he's honest, he was liked, he rode a bicycle when he was the party chief in Santa Clara. He was good to the long-haired kids, he didn't hassle them, so there's an element of that he's a modern man there too. In other words, a kind of hint or promise that he represents a new, gentler, more pragmatic face of the same revolution. But as all of us know, if you give someone power, and depending on when you give it to them, you don't know, and they don't know how they're going to be when they have power. Che sent Jorge Ricardo Massetti off to Argentina in 1964 to be the advance man for his Cuban Revolution in Argentina. What happened to Massetti? Massetti went crazy in the cloud forest and began killing his own men before he ever saw the enemy. A little bit of power turned him into a kind of Aguirre figure. Who could have called that? Certainly Che didn't call it. Neither did Garcia Marquez. He used to hang out with him, and so many others. Maybe even Jorge Ricardo Massetti didn't realize he had a demon with him until he got into the jungle and had some power. So you never know. I'm not being facetious here, but honestly, I can't call it, and I won't call it until we see him in office. As for what shape Cuban society will take with the economic opening, as I say, you're seeing incipient thaw. Ioanni herself is able to travel now. Of course it was her right before. Of course she shouldn't have been denied the right to travel, but now she does, and she uses it. She speaks out. She's not punished for it. And it's also the case of some of the other best-known disidentes. They have a role in Cuba, almost. And the Cubans themselves sort of referred to them, used them as touchstones, saying, who says we don't have a internal criticism? Look at Ioanni. Esta bloguera dice lo que quiere. You know? They know her more and more now. More and more people have internet. The Cubans no se quedan atrás. The Cubans know what's going on. It may be true that in parts of the countryside there's less flow of information. Certainly, you don't see the kind of paladares and the rumbustious new money culture that you see in Havana out in the provinces as much. But it's all percolating slowly. But with that economic change, there is a cultural opening as well. It's gradual. It's one step forward, or rather 2 steps forward, sometimes 1 step back, but it's there, it's happening. There's already a younger crowd in various positions. They understand privately, whatever they say publicly, that certain changes have to happen. In the course of this long revolution, most of the Cuban leadership have had a daughter, son, cousin, brother, daughter, sister, nephew, niece leave the country. Fidel himself. They know. Some of them have kids who've stayed on the island and give them shit when they go home at night. They know that there's discontent. They know. And some actions have been taken in response to this kind of awareness. There's no question Cuba's a different country today than it was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But I can't call it. What it seems to me pretty obvious, though, whatever the downside of this rapprochement between the Americans and the Cubans is, depending on your point of view, whatever the downsides, that there is, we're in a completely different dynamic now, and neither the Cubans are not entirely in control of it anymore, and they know that. And so you have a new kind of fluid, new flexibility. The security state's still there. It will still be there. How they deal with the need to open up, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, something could happen tomorrow. We'll see.
So I'm going to use the privilege of the mic to ask you about journalism. You've worked at almost every conceivable level of American journalism within a certain register. So I want to ask you, having worked for Henry Luce's Time magazine and then The Nation, the two polar opposites, right, of that Cold War understanding of Latin America, how do you see the landscape of journalism and media now, and how is that affecting, American ignorance about Latin America, reporting? Do you see a new generation of American reporters that are not like Herbert Matthews and not like, tendentious in a different way? Do you see maybe a generation that knows about Guatemala? Is there cause for optimism, or is the social mediatization of journalism undermining your forming the idea of a reporter and a journalist
in the way that you were formed?
Well, I think it's both things at once. You know, it's both things at once. It's both a newly democratic template on which a lot more people can have a voice and express it. When I was finding the only outlet I could find for the story about Merida, the San Diego Union, that's the story of yesteryear. Now I would have a blog. 1 million people potentially could read that story today. Probably not if I was just a kid, but you have a chance to be heard, to give vent, to express yourself, to be seen and heard by others in a way that you simply couldn't before. And that's good, that's positive in the broadest possible sense, I think. So that's happening. And I think there are youngsters out there trying to have a go as bloggers, as traveler journalists, as documentarians, doing whatever you can do to bear witness in various places, whether it's with the cartels in Michoacan, or indigenous communities in Bolivia or Guatemala, or in Cuba with the kids who hang out at night on Avenida Los Presidentes, and the unsocial underground scene in, you know, and wherever, Rio and the rest of it. There's a lot going on. What's not happening yet is the kind of monetization, I hate that word, but it's used a lot nowadays. It's the kind of monetization of their work. So it's made for a lot of creative initiatives. You know, something you're getting young people today doing things that, you know, defy definition. It moves from performance installation to journalism. It might do, depending on their particular talents or ilk, yeah. From photojournalism to exhibition to film. They're trying everything they can to survive. A lot of parents are subsidizing this, and so are the various foundations out there. Without George Soros, a lot of this wouldn't have been getting seen or heard or read in a lot of parts of the world for the last 20 or so years. And some have, some have started their own NGOs. Some were always Bleeding Hearts and are out there like helping orphans here, or abandoned women there, or doing art therapy there. And I didn't mean that in any sort of condescending way. I meant that I'm thinking, in each case, I'm thinking of a friend, and also the ones on the dark side. Some have gone off to write screenplays and gone into the movie business. So it's not a told story. There's no ending to this yet. It's all still happening. You know, the ice flow. We're the polar bear, and it's still melting. So, you know, will we adapt in time? I'm not sure. Can we swim to the firm tierra firme? I'm not sure. There is though, and it's something that bothers me. Just end on that question on that. This business of the social media. I do feel that there's an undermining quality to it. Yeah. On the one hand, it's democratic. On the one hand, I think it's great that anybody can talk to me or I can talk to them. On the other hand, it's distracting, and it's a kind of Tower of Babel. I'm not sure how ultimately it helps us all, but it certainly produces a kind of hyper presence of anxious kind of cognition. You know, we know everything all the time, and we feel compelled to stay plugged in. I'm not sure that's entirely good. Meanwhile, all of these other longer, deeper, slower realities stay there. And they're not necessarily reconciled. So.
That's a good
I have a question. Just building on that, I promise it's
Okay.
the last one, and
And
I'll
I'll
be
be
quick.
short, too.
Yeah, and building on that about journalism. Well, thanks for your talk, and I think that the result of your work is not only the courage and the knowledge of the field, but also the quality of the form, the beauty and the strength of your writing. And I'm a journalist, I'm a Brazilian journalist, but I'm also a PhD candidate in history. And I struggle all the time with form. Recently I got one article accepted, and the answer was, it's a great article, we'll publish it, as long as you can deal with the narrative and reduce a little bit the narrative aspect of your writing. It's not academic enough. Did you ever struggle with that in this transition from journalism to academia, or no, and how do you reconcile that?
I haven't made that transition yet. This is just I'm just paracaidista here. Yeah, I wouldn't know what to do about that. I struggled for years just to get my own narrative right, not to worry about making it more or less academic. But I think we all struggle in ways to be as creative and as clear and as honest as possible, whether we're writing more narratively, journalistically, or more academically. I think that's the challenge for all of us. And I would think that we share the same goal, which is to reach as many people as possible, at least within the radius that we choose for ourselves, whether it's the larger world or a defined community. The trick is to do it as well as you can, and I think everybody finds their own, en español, no, buscando el norte, and you find your own horizon line, and I think you try to find a voice that says what you mean in an unadulterated way. And if you can be original and authentic and take the conversation forward even just a little bit, shed just a little bit of light, if not the universal light, but a little bit, then that's not bad. It's not bad. I remember, spending years wondering who was reading my stuff. I had no idea at all. No feedback whatsoever. Now I get too much, but for years I had no idea who I was pitching to. That is to say, where my voice was going. So it's good if you can get to that point, to find out where it is being heard, who's listening or reading, and working on from there. Good luck with that.
I'll quote
Thank
you
you.
and send it to the editor.
I think all other questions you can have over wine. Thank you so much.